All right. Hello. Welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm Dan. I'm recording this on the 21st of August. Um, the topic I have in mind for today is the retrograde of Saturn, which in reverse motion is going to be heading back into Pisces. And that's happening, interestingly enough, on the 1st of the month. On September 1st, this reverse ingress into Pisces is taking place. And this is going to then set up the influence of Saturn over the sign of Pisces during the lunar eclipse that will be happening shortly thereafter. And so, with this in mind, one first thing that comes to mind about this is that the expression a pinch and a punch on the first of the month, which is related to a kind of bitterness and resentment around paying rent, basically. And that the idea is that it's a monthly cycle, that the bills are due, the rent is due, and that I think this, why am I reminded of this? Particularly with Saturn. Saturn often stands for the Senex, or there's some inherent Senex archetype which could be to do with stinginess, or to be like penny pinching, or if you have to then pay the bills, pay rent, and you're just feeling poor, you're on a budget, or there's a certain sense of austerity, right? Or there's also a sense of maturity with a kind of austere approach to life, and not, being frugal and all of this, versus and sort of also resentment from the increasing cost of living, increasing price of things. There's this attitude of, instead of treating yourself to fancy stuff, you're going to like eat like cans of spam, or like you're going to like eat like army rations, right? There's something about the attitude of economic austerity, especially in a war economy, right? And I think that in the current geopolitical context of everything that's going on, I think it's important to remember that we are still a far way away from being in a war economy. For example, there are certain things that happen in a war economy where, even back during World War II, if you wanted to buy a vehicle, you had to ask permission from the government to get to have like a permit to drive a car, because the resources for producing stuff were in such demand for producing military equipment, vehicles and planes and whatever, that you had to justify your expenditure of resources on transportation. And if you could not do this, you were not granted permission by the government to have a car, right? And that in this same sense, when it came to the way that food was rationed out and all this kind of stuff, there's there's a certain kind of stinginess or a penny pinching or that kind of attitude when it comes to Saturn, right? There's also the whole thing about like saving for retirement, how you're distant, what kind of, are you living a luxurious lifestyle, or are you living a kind of a disciplined and austere kind of lifestyle, right? And so with that in mind, that was just one thing that came to mind. But another thing what I was thinking about, which could be relevant to this, I'm inspired specifically by a number of videos that I encountered yesterday on YouTube that I feel are related. And the thing is, I guess in some way, I could just, this is basically a reaction or response to a couple of videos that I saw, but I don't want to there's something about the process of responding to things or reacting to things that I tend to avoid, because I don't want to position myself as a antagonist or an oppositional force of like negativity against somebody or something like that, right? And to try to be, there's something that is inherently adversarial about it, right? And there's something about the arc. Then so that this kind of got me thinking of another archetype to go with Saturn retrograde into Pisces. Is that Saturn rules the opposition? Saturn also associated as the greater malefic, a force of evil, a force of negativity, or something like this, right? There's something about Saturn which there's this archetypal thing that goes back to the Jewish religion and the Old Testament, where there was this idea that, like, if you're getting into heaven or not, the soul being judged and evaluated after death. Do you go to heaven? Do you go to hell? And there's this basic Saturn quality that stands for the falling short of the good, right? That, like, are you gonna, do you have enough virtue, goodness for your soul to go into heaven after death? I'm also just gonna say, first of all, that I don't know if I necessarily agree with a very simple, you go to heaven, you go to hell after you die approach to the afterlife, but there is this thing that comes out of that, of where your soul has there's this adversary spirit, and then there is the spirit that is like on your behalf, which will be, it's like your defense lawyer, right? Like your defense lawyer is being like, oh, well, actually, look, like this, he did a number of good deeds and he was tempted to do this, but he did otherwise, and all these kind of things. But then there's a critic, which is there to try to point out all the ways that you have fallen short, or something like this, right? And there's something about Saturn in the sense, if you go with what I was saying earlier about a pinch and a punch at the first of the month, and the stinginess, or the feeling depleted after having to spend a bunch of money on bills or cost of living expenses, and having perhaps a bitter and resentful attitude about such things, that goes with the this kind of like the bitterness of Saturn, right? Saturn often, like with a flavor palette, Saturn being associated with things like tobacco smoke, coffee, very burnt, caustic, acrid flavors, or something like that, that's the palette of Saturn, right? Smoky, singed, like crispy critter, burnt to a, like that kind of like charcoal, right? Like that's the kind of like Saturn quality. And so there's something about there's something, so the temperament of Saturn is something that is I think there's a basic thing that I've noticed, where it's like the temperament of Saturn is an acquired taste, where that if you can, it can be the similar thing of like, are you going to take your coffee, like, do you like black coffee, or do you like coffee with lots of cream and sugar in it, right? And that if you use a lot of sweetener in your coffee, there's a certain temperament that is more archetypally suited to, let's say, Venus or the moon or something like that. And especially the idea that if you're like watching your calories, you're putting a lot of sugar in your coffee, there's like something about like the plumping up like a full moon or something like this, right? And that there's some kind of the idea of all sorts of things that could be like people may have internalized self-criticism or shame narratives around being negatively judged. And this is the whole thing. People you could have encounters, traumatizing experiences in life, where there are characters who represent basically adversarial or antagonistic figures who kind of play this role of being like the bad guy, right? And that basically you see these kinds of people. There's two ways where you could either see these people as informing you about your own faults and weaknesses, and the ways that you basically don't measure up, the ways that you are weak or deficient or at fault. And these people are basically, you could either characterize these people as like villains and antagonists that are basically fundamentally there to make your life miserable, or to instill a sense of self-hatred and self-loathing on you. Or you could also see that if you are just isolated on your own, you don't have, if you do have legit, I think there is something you have to admit, sometimes there are actual legitimate faults and weaknesses, but there's some kind of problem in that if you take those faults and weaknesses too seriously, then you may lack perspective of the actual the actual meaning or the value of why are these faults and weaknesses so important to be focused on in the first place, right? And that if you get down into the nitty gritty of this kind of adversarial behavior, or the whether it's you feeling like you have a fear of exposing yourself, of like getting up on stage, of presenting yourself to the world, because if you show off your talent, there's also a risk that you're going to show off your faults, your weaknesses, or how people would negatively judge you, because if you're presenting yourself to the world, it's, unless you work that stuff out, it's all there mixed in. It's all just like, you've got good things, bad things. You've got a whole jumble of stuff going on. And that the more visible you are, the more your positive traits and your negative traits are going to be visible, and the more you're going to be exposed to criticism, and the more the critics are going to present to you facts, or at least perceptions about you that perceive you as being somehow at fault or deficient or not living up to the expectations, something like this. And that you can either take responsibility for that and create a self-improvement narrative, or else you can antagonize the people who point out those faults, right? But I'm going to give you a specific example of there's a certain sort of subjectivity to this whole thing, and I'm going to, what comes to mind, basically the best example to use to illustrate this is when it comes to the subjectivity of music taste, right? Because I think there's a difference between music taste and, let's say, something like athletics, where if you are a Olympic sprinter, it's very objective. If you have the start whistle blows and people are sprinting, and then so who's the one who crosses the finish line first, and even if it's like a photo finish, you've got some objective, measurable marker of why the guy who wins the race is superior to the guy who loses the race, and there's nothing like subjective about it. You either win the race or you don't, right? And then when it comes to music, for example, as something that would be different, there are certain measurable outcomes that could be like record sales or popularity. But I think anybody who is a serious music enthusiast would be kind of like, would admit that there's more to music than just how commercially successful it is or how much money you can make. There's like the merit. It actually, a lot of the time, the merits of music, which are considered to be of higher cultural value, may not be successful on the marketplace, right? So there's the idea of, and there's often this association that the demand for the measure of value being money, how much, because money is a universal measure of value, that says whatever is best is the stuff that is able to make the most money, because that is the thing that's most able to support itself economically. And this is, of course, a very sore point when it comes to music, because now you've got things like Spotify, where the owner of Spotify is basically not paying the musicians very much money and making a lot of money which he's then investing on Terminator 2 style, like, killer robot bullshit, which is like absolutely horrific if you appreciate the higher virtue of some sort of higher cultural value of what makes something good or bad, aside from its just ability to perform well on the market, right? Because so the whole problem is that it becomes this thing then where money, in a kind of like, if you take this sort of like, going back to what I was getting in before about like heaven and hell, and the idea of an adversary versus a lawyer who is trying to like say good things on your behalf to argue so that you can get into heaven. If a person is at fault, basically, what if the criticism is that the person is not going to get into heaven, it's going to be something other than money, probably, because there's the old saying, it's easier for a to put, what is it, like, to put a camel through the eye of a needle than to get a rich person into heaven, right? So that if your fault is that you don't have a lot of money, or that if your virtue is that you're able to make a lot of money and economically support yourself, that may be good for certain things. But what these religious traditions tell us is that what that virtue of being good with money is good for isn't specifically getting into heaven, right? And actually, the idea of the temptation of material gain or of wealth and power is basically inherently moralistically associated with the temptations of the devil, basically, right? And so if you like consider that kind of moral dynamic to what's going on, and then you consider the whole idea of being judged as being at fault for some reason, you have to sort of like let's say if you're trying to I don't know, the obvious writing on the wall is like I'm recording a video right now that I'm going to put on YouTube, and what I go through, my strategy is just to like keep making stuff, and I honestly, I don't know. It's not, my approach is to concentrate on the archetype at hand that I'm dealing with for whatever topic it is that's in my next video. And sometimes I think those archetypes lend themselves well to a video that would become popular. Sometimes those archetypes, I just have to do my best with whatever it is, right? This one is challenging in some sense because it has to do with Saturn, perhaps the most negative of all planets of the zodiac. Saturn being that whole thing of stinginess, of falling short, of old age, of endings, of turning the page, like a new, you have to, putting things to end. And there's this idea of when you feel this, the adversary is like, there's some, okay, what I'm trying to get into this too is that I watched a video somebody made about cringe as a Zoomer kind of thing. And this led me to think about the use of the word cringe. And, I have to admit that I look younger perhaps than other millennials, but I am a millennial, and I feel there's a certain generation gap between me and the Zoomer generation, and I don't claim to be hip and with it, and I just like the shit that I'm into, and I don't really know what the young kids are into these days and stuff like that, even though if I may look or present like a young person, there's something about the slang of cringe, which is Zoomer Gen Z coded, and there's something, I was watching this kid who's obviously perhaps of the Zoomer generation talking about cringe, and maybe I'm off base here, speaking as a millennial who admitted, like, at first I'm thinking that this kid doesn't have a very good take on or analysis of cringe. But then it's like, who am I to say that I've got a good take on cringe? Maybe I'm substantially more cringe than this guy is, and that my attempts to analyze what cringe are just expose how cringe I really am because I don't get it, right? I don't know. But this is basically, I've started to think about this, and hold on, I'm going to take a sip of coffee while I think this one over, because there's like multiple ways I can go with this, perhaps. So what I've been thinking of anyways is that you can define cringe in a couple ways though, as cringe culture, as playing off the idea of cancel culture, and that there's something about the social performativity of trying to succeed socially, and then the embarrassment of watching people make social blunders or social failures that is defined as secondhand embarrassment for somebody else, that is cringe because you wouldn't want to be in their shoes because they're getting rejected or not passing a social gatekeeping test or something like that. And I have to say, well, hold on, I'm going to sip my coffee while I think about this. Okay. There's something really funny too, I find, about watching content from Zoomers where they try to talk about like cultural stuff. And as a millennial there's something about astrology which I think you can kind of understand how this works in terms of like, let's use like Pluto generations or something like that. I'm a Pluto in Scorpio millennial, and to compare the generation gap with, let's say, the Pluto in Sagittarius Zoomers or the Pluto in Capricorn Zoomers or whatever. And then I guess once you just start pushing into Generation Alpha, the further you go with these Pluto. But there's something about, with astrology, it's like you've got one zodiac sign that it's like if you have a neighbor sitting at the other side of the wall, basically, and it's like what you are aware of, you might be aware of the person who is like sitting directly across from you, and the opposition of Saturn rules that direct opposition. Like you and your, like having a duel, you and your opponent are like, it's like you both have the same sword and you're squaring off you and your opponent to fight each other. But when the person is like not in this position of direct opposition, they are in a blind spot, right? So the thing about the Saturn is that it has more to do with this direct, what's kind of funny is that the 12th house is more of like this blind spot thing where Saturn has its joy in the 12th house because the blind spot is kind of like this ignorance, right? There's this kind of thing where there's a sort of like area of ignorance versus somebody who's a direct opposition, right? So if you consider these dynamics of the difference between cringe being, or like the difference of like dealing with adversaries or people who are like direct opponents versus the idea that you are trying to win friends or try to increase your aura or social status or your success or popularity or whatever it is, and that you fail in this by making social blunders. I'm going to say that back as a millennial, we had our own millennial slang, and some of this may have even been hyper localized to some extent. But one of the, like, to give you an example of this, I don't know if the Zoomers use these expressions these days, but as a millennial growing up, what we use to describe the phenomenon around this is it wasn't the cringe is to be passively perceiving the social embarrassment and failure of somebody else and sharing in that sense of shared collective shame and humiliation and falling short, right? And that burden of having to just like carry this burden of awareness. And this is why I was thinking, rather than cringe culture, like cancel culture being like people are canceled as in they're not allowed to come to the party anymore and they're blacklisted and we're not serving you at this establishment based on your prior behavior or something, right? There's the cancel culture. Cringe culture is the culture of like the collective sense of shame and embarrassment that we all have to carry, right? That we live in a culture where it was normalized to be outsiders, exiles, social rejects who are all collectively sharing this burden of collective embarrassment and shame and humiliation for each other, as similar to how Jesus would carry the cross and the passion of the Christ, right? And in this sense, but I think it's it become a sick perversion of this. And I think in the sense that if you think about like there was leading, I'm basically going to argue the point that around the time specifically of 2012, there were the New Agers, the psychedelic community were really into this idea that 2012 was going to be like the Mayan apocalypse, or that there was going to be some great transition or shift in consciousness. And what that shift in consciousness was not the coming of a collective Christ consciousness, as the Christian mystics may have presupposed, but rather the advent of cringe consciousness, where we all have to, instead of like having the higher ideal of like a spiritual virtue, we all have to shoulder this kind of collective burden of shame and embarrassment and humiliation, not just for ourselves but for each other, right? And as we all passively watch each other make these social blunders and failures, and not wanting to step in and intervene or criticize or do anything, because then that would just make you a kind of like a control freak, or like some kind of a nanny or something like that, or like trying to be meddling too much. And instead we're just passively sharing this burden of shame and shock and humiliation. Whereas what we in millennials, our version of this, instead of we didn't have the concept of cringe as such a solidified thing. Instead, what we had was I'm comparing it to Stee, right? And the thing about Stee, like, this is the thing, is like, in the way that in order to make, I remember, like, my mother was talking about cringe, but in order for my mother to understand or like make cringe sensible, she had to extend cringe into being cringe worthy, right? But the thing is, if you have to make that move where you have to add the worthy to it's like, you don't understand cringe, but when you say, oh, this is so cringe-worthy, because if I saw that, I would, even as a boomer, I would admit that's worthy of a good cringe, right? I would be cringing myself, even though I don't even know it's cool. I'm a boomer, right? So, like, this is how boomers think about cringe. But from the millennial point of view, the Stee, like, the point of the thing is, if you have to explain what a Stee is, you're displaying that if you don't know what a Stee is, you've never been steed before. If you've never been steed before, then you've never had contact with the social dynamic in which knowing what being steed means is relevant, right? So the fact that you have to go through the motions of explaining what it means to be steed is itself perhaps worthy of a Stee, right? And because you are violating some kind of unwritten social code where the Stee is like a vocal noise that is meant to invoke this sense of shame and humiliation and social failure, and that it happens in such a weird way that if you don't even know what Stee is supposed to mean, like, you just get the affect of it. It's like, it feels like it's mean, and that you're being like, what a fucking loser, Stee, right? Like, it's like, that's what's like, this is the kind of like, but the point is that if you have to explain what being steed is, Stee is the first. It's like taking something that is one syllable, strike, as if you have now, like, even on YouTube, if you use like if you have copyright violations, you get 3 strikes and you're out system, right? There's built into the dynamic of our technology, we have the 3 strike system, right? And the point is that you're supposed to basically condition yourself that if you want to survive and be successful in a certain system where there's a certain established rules and a certain established code of conduct, you have to basically make that so efficient that you understand that you have, like, it's like if you're driving on a road and you have those like rubber cones on the side of the road that are like, if you start veering off if you can't keep your car, going in a straight line, you hit the traffic cone on the side of the road. Like, the Stee is meant to be like, you should know that you're veering off the approved of social codes, and that you don't need us to pronounce the whole fucking word strike. We just need to have as a very sharp Stee, like that kind of thing, right? It's like, and like that as being a kind of like a referee kind of call, like, you're blowing the whistle, Stee, okay, come on, get this guy off the field, okay, penalty box, right? So like, this is like, we have to understand is that, like, as millennials, we we grew up in a highly, like, we have, like, there's this whole thing about, like, there's a policeman in your head, right? An internalized source of, like, identifying, of, like, parental humiliation, of the idea of, like, you're like a gym teacher or like a referee at like a soccer game, and you're like blowing steep, like you're blowing the whistle kind of thing, like you're like, penalty, okay, all right, and you have to keep the game going, right? So there's this so there's in us millennials, we, instead of having cringe as the silent burden of shame and humiliation that we all have to carry passively, the action of Stee was a verb. It was like an action, and that to Stee someone was to position yourself in the role of a kind of a social referee in the whole the game of the social dynamic, right? And that the whole point of this is that if you're hanging out with a group of friends, you don't want your friends to be embarrassing you in social dynamics, right? And there's a certain need to police your friends to keep them in line, so that if you guys have your little crew and you go to a party and you make friends with other people, you don't want to have one person saying stupid shit and creating a bad reputation for your group. So there's this internal kind of social policing, right? Now, I think one of the major differences between millennials and the Zoomers is that as millennials, we actually partied and we went out and we did stuff and we hung out in social groups. We weren't just a bunch of fucking on TikTok all day, right? And there's this kind of idea, if you take Marshall McLuhan, basically, he had the idea of hot media and cold media, right? And there's the idea of being hot or cold, being active and participating in. He used this to talk about the difference between radio and TV, because he argued that if you were on the radio and you didn't have the visual of a video of somebody talking, that you had to fill in. Well, actually, hold on. There's something different, because there's actually more interesting to get more specific about this, was that he got into, you may think that once we had the advent of TV, the introduction of video, that's more or less the same as what we have with YouTube today. McLuhan would argue otherwise, on something very simple as just the lack of resolution in early TV broadcast signals. Because McLuhan said that, like, when TV first was rolled out, that the signal was so poor that the image on the screen was like a fuzzy collection of like statics and dots, and like the people on the screen, you could just like sort of like barely make them out, compared to like now we have everything is super high def, right? And I don't think we really factor this in, where you could basically have the exact same TV show in a Blu-ray, like you could have like the remastered Blu-ray version, versus you could have like a very early TV broadcast of the same thing, but having a very low resolution image, McLuhan argued, made the medium more participatory. And also the fact that, let's say you only had one TV in the house, rather than now we have everybody's got their own TV in their own bedroom or something, right? So if you only have one TV in the house, the screen is very small, the image is really poor, it becomes this participatory process where everybody comes and gathers around and tries to interpret whatever the fuck is going on this shitty primitive TV screen, right? Now we don't have to use, now what we have is less of a collective participatory experience and more experience that is individualized, where each person has their own individual screen. It's much more high def, and as a result of this, instead of doing a something where we all feel like we are participating in in this public thing where we all get together and try to, like, put our focus on the same image, and it's all just a bunch of fuzzy dots on the screen, and then we as a family are like, what's going on the boob tube? What's going on in the squawk box? Now we are all isolated, separated. We've all got our own sets of headphones on. We've all got our own private high def image, and then as a result, it's like, imagine you're coming together with a bunch of dudes watching a sports game, like a soccer game, and the referee calls a bad penalty, And you're, what was that? That was not a penalty. Come on, you know. And so there's something about there's a collective experience of like, this is rigged, you know, that's a penalty, or if like then the referee then is unfair to the other team, and you're like, whoa, what was that? You know, like whoa, you know, like it's like there's this whole collective reaction that if you're just doing that on your own, this is why people like, if you go, it's the difference between going to a movie theater. And it's not just about the movie, it's about this participatory experience with the whole crowd, the whole audience. And that gives rise to if the referee making a call versus the audience playing referee. That's not a strike. This is rigged. This is rigged. Oh my God, you know. And then like you have to afterwards you could have like your drinks after the game, and just that reaction to the unfair call or what the call should have been is like you've got the audience participating in being not the player, but that referee that is like gets to be the one who blows the like. And this is what Saturn is like, the referee in a way, right? Because you guys have your game. You have the rules of the game. You have certain things that are designated as penalties. And every time that you make a penalty, you are falling short of your ability to do a perfect play, right? And so there's a Saturn, and there's this like, you can either, is the referee treated as an adversary, or is the referee treated as a necessary function of the game, that you wouldn't be able to have the game without having the referee there? And then the thing about this is that as millennials, we all had the psychology of being more collectively oriented and being involved in this social refereeing process, right? But I think this social refereeing process ended up becoming cancel culture, and the actual dynamics of this, I don't really like to talk about, because I think, just to be blunt, I think cancel culture, in my experience, had a lot to do with the Me Too movement, and just like when you put this whole thing about social success and social failure, and you put that in the context of a bunch of dudes who are just trying to like succeed with girls, having success with women, or having either being able to do that or not being able to do that, and then having this whole problem of trying to solve that, if you're not able to have that success, trying to problem solve it, and the whole thing about the pickup artist community, the whole thing about the manosphere. There's a whole can of worms around this problem, right? That I think is very much connected to wokeness, very much connected to the manosphere and the alt-right, very much connected to feminism, very much connected to even racism, or there's so many different. For me, that's the thing, is the more I think about this, the more it becomes a kind of a woke social critique, and I'm sort of like, am I just missing it? Because the point is about this. I'm kind of like going all over the place. There was another example that I wanted to use about this with like music taste, whether music taste is subjective or objective. The idea that a sprinter is more objective because it's more objective to measure a foot race than a rock show. But I'm going to give you an example in that two very critically well-respected bands at one point in time did a tour together, and those bands were the Rolling Stones and, well, basically just Prince and his band, right? Now, the thing about this is that what I'm trying to say about commercial success, both artists, very commercially successful, very well respected in the general music industry and stuff like that. But there's something about rock and roll, and as an industry, as a commercial business, that the average status quo of the consumer of rock and roll music is meant to be pop music for the population at large, the average Joe, the working class. And there's some kind of dynamic with the Rolling Stones in that these are a bunch of British dudes who are like artists. And if you look at Brian Jones too, before Brian Jones died, they were even more like this sort of like airy fairy. They had this really kind of like, very, playing the sitars and having the frilly shirts and all this. They're not really, the Rolling Stones are not exactly, like they kind of balanced this dynamic of being these like posh, prissy British guys, but then also may be somehow knowing what their consumer audience wanted in terms of just basic like barroom rock and roll drinking music, right? And so that they're kind of like balancing their identity as artists and creators with the demands of the market to be very successful, to the point they're still doing these huge massive tours that draw in tons of people and stuff like that. But the price you have to pay for that level of popularity and success is that the average consumer has a certain kind of what they value, what their value system is, right? And the thing about rock and roll is that rock and roll always has this sort of tendency to cross into like either, let's say, drag, or kind of like there's a certain kind of like diva, kind of like opera singer, maybe even like something about being a performer on stage that has to do with theater, or the idea of, I don't know, I guess even minstrelry could be another angle you go with it. You see what I'm saying, though, right? Is that the person who is the performer is often, there's a tendency to go in the direction of being kind of effeminate or theatrical, or having all these qualities which do not resonate with the value system of the proletariat working class, right? And so there's something about this when you take those qualities, and what I find really funny about it too is that there's a whole also issue about wokeness and cancel culture. I'm playing it in a certain direction, but there's something I've been avoiding this because I've been trying to avoid getting into the culture war or conversation about like social isolation versus in-group belonging, or being cancel culture being kind of self-defeating because you end up alienating yourself from your whole community because nobody lives up to your impossible standards, right? But the thing is, in the experience of socializing with people as an adolescent, as a young man, if the people you're socializing with start to like become like overtly racist or overtly homophobic, there's something about it where it's like, rather than just being like, I'm going to like enforce my own gatekeeping and cancel culture by just like exiting if you have a social circle where there's a certain level of racism and homophobia and bigotry and stuff like that, that's just standardized as acceptable, then it's like, regardless of whether this is a beneficial like social move for me to make to like distance myself or exit myself from those kinds of social in-groups, there's something about how my own principles as a person that is, regardless of like, you know, it's not like social ladder climbing. It's like I legitimately just wouldn't enjoy being around people who hold those kinds of views, and like maybe distancing myself from those people. Like, but there's this kind of argument that people make where like you're like, oh, but there are like black people who like make friends with neo-Nazis and convert them over to the other side. I think there's a different dynamic when there's that extreme of a polarity that you're trying to resolve versus people who start out kind of similar and then one person starts leaning in a direction that is extremely racist or bigoted or homophobic or something like that. And there's the contradiction, like there's something where people might really like, you know, that what is accepted as like the popular white guy rock and roll music. But then you're like, yeah, so what about Freddie Mercury? Okay, what about David Bowie? What about Prince or something, right? And so there's this kind of like people like there's this thing. Prince actually had to stop touring with the Rolling Stones because the kind of audience that he had were very adversarial or very of his queerness, not just his queerness, but the fact like his like overt queerness of being very in your face about his queerness, and there's just something about the Saturn again in being like queerness, even if you affirm the heteronormative standard, there's always going to be queerness that exists in the inability to live up to that standard, right? And so the thing is, like, there could be people that would be like, if a band just like, the opening band is just really not a very good band, and they're like booed off the stage or humiliated for not having talent as a musician, and you would think, okay, basically that this whole thing about this kind of internalized adversary or this criticism or something like that, that it's at some extent, if you are if you're trying to like win over music critics or something like that, there's some way about like understanding the criticism of the people that judge you that is sort of relevant to your development and growth as an artist. But if you're Prince and you're being judged for being queer or being very, like, your whole shtick as an artist is specifically to express the thing that these people are adversarial to you, and that it's sort of like, maybe like the ugly duckling, right? Or in the sense that you can't judge a goose or a swan or whatever it is for being a duck, because you're creating a category where you're like, we're not judging you based on whether or not you perform well or whether or not you're talented at writing songs or whatever like that. We're judging you because we have because of a internalized shame, and because we have these father figures who, as children, when we veered off into there's a certain, you have to stay on track to what it means to be heteronormative male, and that if you walk around in high heels on stage, then that is the absolute opposite of it. And so that when for me, cringe is kind of like this, right? It's because there's a certain thing of like this. It's funny because it's like, if in this context of cringe, that you could be like a huge Prince fan and love Prince, but then and affirm Prince as just being great for all the kinds of reasons, but then in knowing that he's going to play a show opening for the Rolling Stones in front of that kind of crowd that are going to react so adversely to him, that it's cringe. Because there is there's actually something there the point is that for the audience that you're doing it for, it doesn't land for that audience, right? And so that if you can understand what the audience wants, and you're valued for your ability to understand what the audience values and to adjust what your product is accordingly to meet the needs of the audience. And then if you're judging Prince's value as a musician based on his ability to do that, then you're like, well, if you're the kind of person who values musician based on whether or not he wears high heels rather than whether or not his music's good, what does that say about you as a critic, where you're not even there, you don't even care about the music, you're just there because you have an internal, like, you can't enjoy the show without having the ghost of your abusive, oppressive father showing up and to say that, oh my God, if I wore high heels or women's clothing on stage, my father would beat me. And why did this guy not get the message that if you do that, you're going to be the victim of homophobic, patriarchal abuse? I better fill in that gap. Right? It's up to me, it's my responsibility to throw a beer bottle at that guy because obviously his father didn't beat him enough, right? And if that's the subjectivity that's making the criticism of you, and you don't appeal to that subjectivity, good, yeah, great. Don't fucking appeal to that subjectivity, right? And it's like, but the thing about cringe is what is cringe? Is like Prince isn't cringe. But that there's a certain thing of like, in what situation is cringe relevant and accurate versus is not, right? And that if you the whole thing is you could say that the to be aware of your own faults and your own failures and your own shortcomings is you could either carry that as this oppressive burden of shame and humiliation, or you could see that there's a certain subjectivity in how that's coded, and that for one kind of audience, what's being judged as being deficient for another audience is exactly what they're looking for. And this is it's not, the problem isn't about this being objective, but the whole point is if it's being selected as being good or bad, for what purpose is this good or bad for, right? And then when you get into the whole, it's perhaps this is too obvious to need to be explained, that there is if you are selecting for something like police or the military, there is more of a controversy of whether or not trans people are included into that, because you're saying that if we think that to make a good policeman, you need to have the attributes that we associate with being strong, like whatever it is that these guys end up being like, which tends to be usually coded as not what we would think of, like the people who are very queer and effeminate, right? And so the thing is that you have to understand that the value system isn't just in a vacuum. It's actually exists in a context where the selection process, I would argue, is part of this whole thing to create people who are going to be to join the army, to join the police force, to join XYZ. And there's basically people. There tends to be certain personality types who are more approved of, that fit into that, and ones that don't. And because people live at have this mentality of basic, like, at the end of the day, it's just life or death, because, we could all just take out guns and shoot each other. Then, like, from that, like, basically, by appealing to that, you are reinforcing the, like not really the most developed perspective, nuanced and civilized perspective on what life is about, right? You're kind of like catering to something that if you fail to cater to that, it's not really that much of a failure. But then there's also, I don't know, it's just my personal taste with music and art and stuff like that, is that I find in my preference, or the best musicians are the ones that somehow take this Saturn, knowing where that limit is of like where they fall short, where they're unable to meet expectations, where they're unable to do it like the other people, and somehow try to engineer that so that it works actually in their advantage, because then it's something that is actually is their unique brand of whatever they're doing. That other people would not be able to replicate, because other people may have the entirely different set of flaws and problems to deal with, right? And then, and then there's a question. I mean, there's this other question of whether you are like what is objectively a flaw, a problem, or a fault, versus what is just subjectively judged to be one based on the perspective of a certain kind of subjectivity, which is itself continually constructed and reinforced by very intentional forms of cultural conditioning, right? I think this is basically the idea I'm going for. But okay, the thing about this is that I would like to argue that cringe consciousness came into existence around the time of 2012, and that, basically based on my own life, I had to, in the post-2012 era, I had to experience a lot of cringe situations, right? So I think I know this kind of thing of witnessing other people's failures and feeling embarrassed for other people. But the thing is, the funny thing about it is that, like I said, when you are a millennial back in high school or whatever, an adolescent, there's more of a participatory experience. But then when it's just you and some other person that you're embarrassed for, there's some kind of different dynamic where you tend to just okay, I'm not going to be an adversary to you. I'm not going to yell Stee at you. I'm not going to be judgmental. Okay, I'm going to be there, be supportive in a non-critical, non-judgmental way, but there's something about this where it's like there is a fault there, right? And there tends to be this whole industry of self-improvement that builds itself up around people who are burdened by the sense of being deficient, of being embarrassed to be themselves, of having all these faults and stuff like that. And there's some sort of self-improvement industry which seeks to remedy people's perceived sources of shortcoming. And I think the manosphere is really about this, right? Because the manosphere is really about if you have a lot of muscle, if you're really tough and strong, if you're very, or even if you're like, and you can also just take more testosterone, right? If you're more of this testosteronal male person, it's like you demand respect, because if people don't respect you, you just give them a fucking punch in the face, basically, right? And like, this is kind of like, the idea is that the only thing which determines respect is just sheer brutal force of violence and intimidation, and that, right? You know what I'm trying to say? Like, there's that is what people are resorting to as a way of just for self-improvement, or just to to make themselves. You perceive the way that there's some kind of like default. As a man, there's some sort of default expectation for what you're supposed to be like as a man. That you're feeling effeminate, you're feeling emasculated, you're feeling weak, you're feeling disabled, you're feeling like you're like the cripple, right? You're like the hunchback from Notre Dame. You're crippled, disfigured, ill, alien, abnormal, right? You're outside of what is approved of and what is accepted, and you carry the burden of the self-awareness for all the ways in which you do not live up to these expectations, right? And from this, you become a great market, a great target market for a whole industry of self-help and self-improvement, right? And the fact that it's, even if you don't change anything about yourself, if you develop the capacity towards self-acceptance, then this is itself a kind of self-improvement, right? That could be a product that you market to people. You don't have to change anything about yourself other than accepting yourself. And because you're unable to do that, I'm the guru who's going to teach you how to do it, basically, right? I'm going to teach you how to accept yourself, even if it means not improving yourself or change or making anything better. And the thing is, I'm kind of being sort of sarcastic, but I think there's an argument to be made for this perspective. Alan Watts said that to improve yourself is impossible, because the thing that needs improving is the same thing which itself is bound up with the identification of judgments, perceived faults, perceived deficiencies, perceived value judgments, and that thing lacks the metacognition to step outside itself and self-evaluate its own valuations. Does that sound too complicated? He said, Alan Watts described it as that you cannot use a knife to cut itself, or like a scissors to cut itself. The knife can only cut another object, because you can't bend the fucking knife around so that it cuts its own handle, right? And so the thing is that what you get these people who are bound up in social dynamics, where they are bound up in seeking approval, validation, in-group belonging, and that the whole social embarrassment is usually bound up with whether you pass this gatekeeping test or not. And usually, and at the most basic level, if this is just a bunch of like hetero white guys who are looking to get laid or something like that, the point is that oftentimes what these guys are being criticized for is having the perspective that has this very narrow kind of judgment system, right? Or very kind of valuation system of if you ask these people, what do you want out of life? What do you want for yourself? What do you desire most in life? What are your goals, dreams, and aspirations? If these people just want to like experience basic hedonistic pleasure, and that they are faulting themselves because instead of being able to achieve that, they just have a bunch of shame and embarrassment and social humiliation and stuff like that, but they're basically still attached to the outcome of living a life where they're just partying and having all this hedonistic pleasure and stuff like that. The point is that if you improve yourself to the point where you understand the criticism and you integrate that, but you still are attached to the value system, of like what do you want in life? If you're like I want to make myself better so that I can get I just want to go and I just want to get drunk and have like lots of casual sex with no commitment and in the most sleazy way possible, but then I'm ashamed if people judge me for that, and I want to improve this so I don't feel the guilt and shame and humiliation if that's what I want in life. There's like, okay, well, you go through all this process of integrating that criticism and building a new personality. But then if you integrate, then you're going to value, the problem isn't that I don't get that outcome, is the problem that I have a very kind of basic status quo. Like I have the value system of somebody who goes to a Rolling Stones concert who judges the person wearing it's not whether the music is good, it's that the guy wearing high heels makes me feel uncomfortable, because then that reminds me of all the times where I was around a bunch of guys who made fun of me if I was effeminate, and then I don't like that feeling. And why do I'm confused. Why do people want to see this on the stage? Can we just get some normal rock and roll guys and that make me feel better, kind of thing? And then you're like, okay, great. Now they got the headliner playing, and now I'm a hetero white guy, I just want to get laid with some random girl, and then oh my god, I keep getting rejected, and then you're like, what am I doing wrong of why people don't like me? And it must be because I'm too much like the guy who wears high heels. I'm too much like the effeminate girly man. I just have to lift a bunch of weights. I just have to get really muscly. I just have to be really intimidating and tough. And so that if people, instead of being sensitive, it's more about just brutal violence or something. And then then people just know not to criticize me, right? They know not to criticize me or offer this adversarial rejection or something like that, because they'd be scared, because I'm a tough man. They would be scared of my violent reaction, right? And then this is like what Jordan Peterson is like, where you're the beast, right? You have this like, if somebody does something you don't like, you're just like, you let your monster come out and you show them that, because I'm just a very violent, tough, aggressive dude. You have to be walking on eggshells around me and not criticize me about anything, or else I'll just blow up at the drop of a handle. And then this is the value system that basically creates toxic masculinity, basically, right? Whereas instead you could just take a step back and be like, but the whole point is like, it's become this very like, if you are not like that, you must be like a queer, basically, right? Or you must be it's like this, and like you, I don't know. In the whole and this is we understand is that like, but this is, if you're the person, the default subject of the person who's going to be like, we're going to have big stadium rock events where you're going to buy tickets to see the popular bands, and you're going to put yourself in that crowd, and then you're going to be surrounded by a crowd of people who are basically there to like gay bash and try to get laid, and then you're going to be like, whoa, why do I feel uncomfortable in this environment? Why am I being judged as being just a little like pansy-ass queer boy? And then why, if I'm not like that, then I also like, well, I have trouble, meeting girls in this environment, right? And you're like, you're like too in that environment to say like, well, why don't you just like look for success somewhere else, right? Why don't you just, or like try to put yourself in a community that has a different kind of valuation, right? But there's the problem of basically totalitarianism is saying that there's the correct form of evaluation, and then there is what you call social and cultural degeneracy, right? Which is because like the same way these people are just saying that you're like, because you can't go on stage and perform without putting on high heels or makeup, this means that because you have to let everybody know how gay you are, this is a form of what the Nazis called social cultural degeneracy, and that it is your moral duty to gay bash people, to promote a kind of but it ends up creating a cultural stagnation, because basically, it's the perspective of resentful people who, like how Hitler never got into art school, right? And kind of the resentment of the debasement of whatever is successful. You're like, I don't get it. I don't get why society evaluates these things as being popular and successful when my dad beat me if I valued things that were like that, right? And so that I have some sort of duty to reproduce this sort of like toxic masculine thing in that value judgment system. And there's something about this whole thing where it's like, we don't have, in the Zoomer generation, like, what's the cultural consensus? There's this, all the Zoomers are going to these weird alt-right attitudes, which basically to them, that's where cringe culture comes in this context, where you're so on your phone that you're not participating in an actual grounded in-person, you're not actually participating in a bunch of people getting together and having to deal with that playing out in person of like navigating where you're failing in to read social cues, where you're failing to do the right thing, or where you're basically your attempts to oppress people, to win people, make friends, or to win over girlfriends or whatever. Like, you're having less of that, and you're more just passively consuming media, where you're also even afraid even to interact or react, and instead you just have to feel collectively embarrassed for the failures of everybody else. But now we're too afraid to even if to play the social role of refereeing, so we just it's an attitude of oppressive shame and humiliation that becomes kills the creative spirit, right, and makes everybody too embarrassed and humiliated to present themselves to the world. Basically, I don't know, and I have to admit that I have a certain kind of performance anxiety, a certain stage fright, a certain, whatever, the internalized pressure of all these conflicting forces where you're like, oh, I can't say this because somebody will be violent or negatively judge me or something like this. But wait, what if that guy's just an asshole? Right? And then what if actually, if people, there would be an opportunity for to say the same thing and be valued positively for it, and that my whole fear of the wrong people criticizing me is just obstructing my creative process and stopping me from making the positive connections that would make my life better, right? Like, it's like, but we can't even approach this because we're too just burdened down by the oppressive cloud of shame and humiliation and resentment, and basically just stinginess, right? A lack of generosity for the other, right? So this is what's on my mind today for the topic of Saturn retrograde into Pisces and the subsequent lunar eclipse. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like and subscribe. I will see you next time.